So good evening and welcome everyone. My name's Pastor Steve Hofford. Welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church and our latest community education series, Food and Land Justice in a Time of Climate Crisis. Tonight's event is the second in a year-long series of lectures, garden and cooking demonstrations, movie nights, and our very popular Spirit Songs concerts. It is our hope that in this series we might discover things we can do, find hope in what has already been done, and learn new tools and techniques together, all in the hopes of stopping, stalling, or reversing the impending climate doom, as well as seeking a more just world where our God-given resources are more carefully tended and the fruits of which are more equitably enjoyed. Here at Redeemer, our tagline is finding life in community. And so we realize we can do none of those things without engaging with and building community with the neighbors around us. This, of course, isn't as easy to do during a worldwide pandemic. And so we are very appreciative to all of you who have joined with us online from near and far. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I have just a couple of housekeeping items and an invitation to our next event. First of all, for any of you joining us on Zoom, you will notice if you are on a computer or laptop, in the top right corner of your screen, you should see a button that says View. For this event, I suggest you set it to speaker view. If you're using a smartphone or tablet, it should have automatically started in speaker view, but if not, you should be able to swipe right until you arrive at the first screen, which is the active speaker view. During the first part of tonight, your microphones will be muted. Please leave them muted until the question and answers at the end. However, we do encourage you to use the chat function for your comments and suggestions, and Dr. Keesmaat will use those to guide her talk. I will be monitoring messages on Facebook for anybody who's watching from there, and I'll copy and paste those into the Zoom chat window as well. Our next event will take place on June 21st, which is National Indigenous Peoples Day. At 6 p.m., we will welcome Eric Johnston from the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto, who will share Indigenous teachings with us and also speak of an inclusive past that has been lost to us. And then he's going to share his ideas on how we might connect now and partner together for environmental justice. So mark June 21st on your calendars, and other events will appear on our website as details become finalized. And finally, we try to offer as many of these events as pay what you can. And so we are very grateful for the financial support of the Eastern Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, as well as the City of Toronto and their Live Green TO initiative. And of course, the support of our neighbors and friends who are committed with us to finding life in community and our shared values of environmental and social justice. If you can and would like to contribute, please go to our website, redeemerlutheran.ca, and click on the Donate Now button in the upper right-hand corner. And I'll also put a link to that in the chat. Now to tonight's event. Resistance, Regeneration, and Justice, Ecological Wisdom from an Ancient Text. Imperial control of land and food systems stretches back throughout history. Oddly enough, the ancient stories of the Bible provide surprising strategies for resistance, regeneration, and justice. Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat will illustrate for us how the biblical story demonstrates how the problems of food and land injustice are deeply rooted in history, and how this same story provides strategies for imaginatively creating a community of abundance where all creatures, plant, animal, and human can flourish. Dr. Keesmaat is a permaculture farmer, writer, and activist. She teaches biblical studies part-time at Trinity College at the University of Toronto and is the co-author with Brian Walsh of Romans Disarmed, Resisting Empire, Demanding Justice, and Colossians Remixed, Subverting the Empire. She speaks widely on issues connected to creation, land, and food justice, and she lives on a permaculture farm in Cameron, Ontario, with a fluctuating number of people and animals. Last fall, I was able to audit her course, Land, Food, and Justice, The Biblical Witness, and what a journey it was. She took us from despair at the reality of the crisis we find ourselves in to hope at the enormous potential Mother Earth has for healing and regeneration. I'm not sure how much of that entire semester she can cover in just over an hour tonight, but I do know that we are in capable hands. Welcome, Dr. Keesmaat.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for that great introduction. And it's wonderful to join you virtually this evening from our farm where there is wind and rain brewing outside right now. This evening, I'll be talking about resistance, regeneration, and justice. And we'll be looking at the context of some of the biblical narratives, particularly the ways in which the wider cultural context helps us understand these stories as stories of resistance and as stories of regeneration and justice. And we only have an hour, so we're not going to do a whole 12-week course tonight, but we'll be looking at a couple of stories that I think are seminal in depth, and then talking about a couple of others, and then launching into our own context around creation and justice. And particularly what we're going to focus on this evening is the food supply, because food, access to food, access to land, and how our food supply impacts creation and creational health is central to the biblical story and needs to be central to how we think about climate change and justice for creation and for those who are most marginalized in our world. So I'm going to begin by talking for a few minutes about the Babylonian creation story. And that's because I'm going to start with Genesis chapter 1 and 2 in the biblical text. And Genesis 1 and 2 were written down, were formulated in their final form in the context of, against the background of Babylonian, Sumerian, and Akkadian creation myths. And so in order to understand the import of that story as indeed a story of resistance, it helps to know what the Babylonian myth was. So I'm just going to very briefly tell part of that story, and I'll share my screen so that you can see the words, some of the words that are unusual that I'll be saying here. So the Babylonian creation story is called the Enuma Elish. And that story is a story about the gods, like so many ancient creation stories, in which the gods engage in various kinds of battles and power struggles. And the way the world is created in the Enuma Elish is that the god Marduk defeats Tiamat, who is actually the mother of the gods, and he defeats her in a cosmic battle. And her body is cut in two, and half of her body is put on creates the sky, and the other half of her body is beneath that, and that is the earth. And her pierced eyes, her head turns into mountains, and her pierced eyes are the two major rivers of the ancient world, the Tigris and the Euphrates. So this is the story of how the earth, the heavens and the earth came to be, this cosmic battle. And then Tiamat's husband is a problem. He's still around, and Marduk has to figure out what to do with him. So Kingu is her husband, and he is cut up into pieces. He's killed to make human beings. And human beings are created as the slaves of the god. They are to work the land so that the gods can be fed. Because now that this earth exists, the gods don't want to have to go to the effort of actually providing food for themselves. So human beings are created out of the blood of this rebel god in order to work the earth and feed the gods. Now, there are some pictorial pictures we have of from ancient Babylon, from ancient Sumer, actually, that show us how this looked when they pictured it. This is a warak or an uruk vase. And I've got some pictures that zoom in on it. It's a vase made for the Sumerian goddess Inanna, and it's from Uruk, which is in southern Iraq. And it shows the hierarchy of the natural order. So I'll show you this in a little closer up. So on the very bottom, you see plants growing, and above that are animals, and those are cattle and sheep and goats. So the animals that were relied on for agriculture. And above that is a row of slaves. You could tell they're slaves because they don't have any clothes on. And they are slaves, and they're carrying baskets full of food. And these are the bottom three tiers of this vase. And the top, you see a slave has finally arrived at the goddess Inanna to give her the offering, which is this basket of food. And the two reed doorposts behind her are the entrance to her shrine and her storage area. So all around this vase, like in a circular pattern, are slaves parading up to give her all this food, which goes into the storage area. And the buildings in which all this food was stored looked like this. This is what's called a ziggurat. And this is a reconstruction of a ziggurat in ancient Babylon. And you can see what the tops of the buildings looked like. It's enormously tall. If you think Tower of Babel when you see this, you won't be far off. Now, you can't see anybody climbing the steps here, but just imagine all those figures on that vase climbing these steps endlessly to carry food up to the shrine of the goddess in the top of that ziggurat. This whole building was a storage facility for food. So I'll actually stop the share now. All of the slaves brought food to the goddess. And of course, who served the goddess but the priests and the elites? So they were bringing food to the goddess, to the priests and the elites, to put that into this huge storehouse. Now, occasionally I'm going to ask some questions, and those of you who have a keyboard in front of you and can put things into the chat, when I ask questions, if you want to just type quick answers into the chat, then we'll have a little bit of a discussion going too. So you just saw the design of that vase. What do you think that it communicates to people in the ancient world about how the world is ordered and their place in it? What is the character of the world if you have that vase with all the plants on the bottom and then the animals and then all these slaves bringing food up to the goddess? How do you think people felt about how the world was structured when they saw those kinds of images and when they heard the kind of story that I have just outlined for you, that creation is made from this destruction of Tiamat, and that human beings are created from the blood of the gods? If that was your origin story, how do you think you would feel about how you fit into the world? What do you think? Any ideas? I know it's a brand new story, so it might. I mean, that vase is a vase of hierarchy, right? The world is ordered in hierarchy. Yeah, and Klaus has just put that on there. So and human beings are a little bit above the animals, but they're below the gods, certainly. And they're the only person who isn't engaged in labor in that vase is the goddess. Everybody else had enormous baskets. So Ed says would make you feel hopeless, right? You only existed to serve the gods. And human beings, Lionel points out, are the product of violence. So that's it. Not just human beings. Christine points out that human beings are low on the pecking order. And it's not just human beings that are the product of violence, but the very earth on which we live. and the heavens are the product of violence. And human beings are created out of a rebel God. So they're low on the pecking order, but they're just created to do the grunt work of the God. There is no dignity in being human in this story, right? What I'm going to do now is read parts of Genesis chapter 1 to you. And I'm going to ask you a similar question. What is the effect of this story? What does it communicate to us about the character of the world and our place in it? Particularly now that we've got that Enuma Elish story in our heads. So how might the first hearers, the ancient Israelites who heard this story from Genesis 1, how would they have heard it in that echo chamber of the Babylonian myth? So let me read a few selections, just parts. I won't read everything from Genesis 1, but parts of it. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God, and the word for wind in Hebrew is the same word as spirit, so it could be the spirit of God, swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. I'm going to skip over to the third day now. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together God called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. Now, the fourth day was the creation of the lights in the sky. I'm going to skip that day. The fifth day, and God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind, with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So, what kind of a world is this? What does this story communicate to us about the world that we live in and who we are in the world? What are some of the differences with the Enuma Elish story? I knew I was going to stumble over that at least once. The Enuma Elish story that I read earlier. Did you notice some of the repetitions in this story? At the end of every single day, God says, "And it was good." God saw that it was good. There's this sense of delight in the story. that God is taking delight in creation. In fact, it's kind of like, I don't know if any of you cook or sew or paint, after you've created something and you think, oh my, that's really, really good. That you have that sense of joy that God has in creation. But also notice this incredible diversity of creation. And this is also part of a Genesis 2 story, but the Genesis 1 story, God says to the earth, let the earth bring forth living creatures. And so when God says later on, let us create humankind in our image, I think God is talking to the earth. We are created out of the earth in Genesis 1. And we are created out of the earth in Genesis 2. So when we continue to read this biblical story, and we get to Genesis 2, God kneels down in the earth and sculpts out of the earth a human being, and that human being uh, is then placed in a garden that God creates, and that garden, the human being is called to serve and observe. Usually it's translated to tend and to keep. But a better translation is to serve and observe that garden. So I'm gonna share my screen again and just outline some of the things that have come up in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So in Genesis 1, creation is not the result of violence, right? Creation is the result of God's speaking. Creation, human beings are also in the image of God in this story. That's who we image. So if we want to know what it is to be truly human, we need to look at the kinds of things that God does in the story. And what does God do but create? Abundance is to be shared with human beings and all other creatures. So later in Genesis 1, in the bit I didn't read, it says that God says to the people, every fruit-bearing tree is given to you for food, everything that has fruit with a seed in it. And all the other plants, the grasses, are for the other creatures for food. So there's this sense that all of creation is to be shared. It's an abundance. And such abundance is a gift. So instead of this sense that in order for there to be food, you need to work like crazy, creation is abundance. There's diversity. There's everything you could need. And human beings, there's this sense, there's this repetition in the text that we are given every fruit with the seed in it. Part of our job is to maintain the seed supply, ensure that food can continue. The story of Genesis 2, where we're created from the earth, human beings are called Adam. And the word Adam means from the earth. We are Adam from Adamah. Adamah is the word for earth. So we are earth creatures from the earth. And all the other creatures in Genesis 2 are also created from the earth. So we are all kin with those other creatures. So unlike that hierarchy in the Babylonian story, there is actually a relationship. And we are called to till and to keep, to serve and observe. And so if we put these two stories together, the Enuma Elish and the Genesis story, we get some stark contrasts. We get the imperial story, so that's the Babylonian story, creation's rooted in violence. Biblical story, creation is rooted in God's word. Or God's delight, actually, is a better way to put it. God's delight is the basis of creation. In the imperial story, human beings are slaves. In the biblical story, human beings are the image of God. In the imperial story, abundance is the result of hard labor. In the biblical story, abundance is a gift from God. In the imperial story, human beings are meant to serve the gods. In the biblical story, human beings are meant to serve God and the land. And in the imperial story, all creatures are in a hierarchy. In biblical story, all creatures are kin. In the imperial story, creation is meant to serve the needs of the gods. And in the biblical story, creation is a gift where all creatures live in relationship. Do you see how different that story is? So the biblical story provided this fundamental challenge to to um, to the Enuma Elish, this story that devalued people, that created a hierarchy that made it possible for the elites to engage in oppressive economic practices that kept the bulk of the population producing food for those elites. And in the Babylonian system, those ziggurats that I showed you that picture of, that looks like a pyramid, what the Babylonians did was they engaged in incredibly intensive agriculture. So they could fill up those ziggurats with food. They irrigated the heck out of the soil till it became too saline to actually be fertile, and then they just abandoned those areas and they moved on. It's not that different than what cash cropper farmers do today, right? They just deplete the soil till it's exhausted and then sell and move on. Up around where I live, they sell the land to the quarries once they've exhausted it. And then they use it as quarry stone to go to Toronto. That was a pattern set in the ancient world. The Genesis story talks about creation being a gift, talks about human beings being the ones who are to serve and observe creation, to care for creation, talks about the relationship that we live in with all of creation. And this means something fundamentally different for how the land is treated in the biblical story. Um, the land is not something to be abused, not something to be used up in this particular story. And we'll see that as the story goes on. I'm going to move on to another story that sets up this contrast between kind of an imperial agricultural system and the biblical story now. And this is the story of Joseph. I think some of you might know the story of Joseph. If you haven't read it ever in the Bible, you probably know the story of Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, and how Joseph ended up in Egypt, and Pharaoh had all these dreams, and Joseph interpreted them for him and told him there was going to be 7 years of abundance during which he should gather together all the grain in Egypt. And then there were going to be 7 years of famine. And during those 7 years of abundance, Pharaoh should ensure that there would be enough food for the years of famine. The part of the story that doesn't make it into Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat is the story of what happened during the famine. And this is told in Genesis 47. In Genesis 47, the first year of the famine, the people of Egypt come to Joseph and they say to him, "We have no food. Allow us to buy seed for food." Um, and grain for food. And Joseph says, "Sure, give me all your money." So they give him all their money for grain that first year. The second year, the people come to Joseph and say, "We have no money, but we need food." And Joseph says, "No problem. Give me all your animals, all your cattle, all your flocks, and I will give you grain for food and seed for sowing." So the people give Joseph all their flocks. Just think of the implications of that. While the people did eat grain for food, their goats provided them with milk and with cheese. The sheep provided them with milk and with cheese and wool for their clothing. These animals produced much more than meat for the people. And any other cattle they had was used to help sow the crops, right? By helping to till the soil. So you can just imagine the grief of the people. They have grain, but they no longer have their animals. That's the second year. The third year, they come to Joseph and they say, "Please, Lord," they call him my Lord. "My Lord knows that we no longer have any money and we no longer have any animals. All that is left is our bodies and our land. Please take us and our land as slaves." and give us grain. It's a very interesting story because the people realize that they are intimately connected to the land. They know that without the land, they have nothing. But they also know that without them, their land has no one to care for it, that the land cannot thrive if they are not living in relationship with it. So they offer themselves and their land up. And Joseph says, with that smile, I think that only someone in power can have when they've backed people into a corner. Sure, that's a good deal. You will become slaves along with your land. And what that meant practically was that the people had to give a fifth of their crop every year to Pharaoh, 20% of their crop. And that's pretty significant because in the ancient world, in a bad year, having to give up a fifth of your crop could mean the difference between having enough to eat and starving. But this also meant that the people were obliged to work for Pharaoh. So we actually have some photos of how agriculture happened in the ancient world. And you'll see that here's a summary of what Joseph did. The first year he takes all their money, the second year all their animals, and the third year their land, and enslaves the people. Egypt was great at keeping records. So here are a couple of photos that show agriculture in ancient Egypt. And Egypt was a very sophisticated export economy in the ancient world. Writing originated in ancient Egypt so that tally could be kept of everything that was harvested, every sheaf of grain, every piece of fruit. So you'll see in the bottom right hand of the screen there an official sitting there, and you'll see foodstuffs piled up in front of him, and that's symbolizing the foodstuffs that he kept track of. He made sure that everything was coming in that should come in. And in the black and white image, you see slaves working in the fields, bringing in on the top level, bringing in the barley and the wheat. On the second level down, you'll see men with sticks herding animals. And you'll also see men with sticks, and those sticks are raised against people, right? People who are tying together a sheaf. That symbolizes the kind of violence that was necessary to keep slaves working. And the ones on that second row down, the men with sticks coming and being faced with the taskmaster are actually coming to beat the sheaves out. On the third line down, you'll see the sheaves are complete, and they're carrying those sheaves. They're putting them on the donkeys to carry them to the storehouses. The fourth line down, they've reached the storage places, and they're piling them up. Those are actually pictures of the storehouses. They're kind of like stylized pyramids, and they're putting the sheaves of wheat and barley into them. The second from the bottom, you'll see animals that are being herded again. And on the bottom, you'll see them, a wheat field again with people working in the wheat. In ancient Egypt, this export economy meant that the people were building the storehouses, the pyramids, and they were also working in the fields. And the people of Israel, when we first meet them in this story, they are the migrant workers of Egypt. They're building storehouses, and they're doing every kind of field labor, it says in Genesis chapter 2. They are enmeshed in the system. So in Exodus 2, when the people of Israel, or actually Exodus chapter 1, when we first meet them, this is the kind of system that they're a part of. It's an imperial food system that depends upon slaves. And if you know this story, Moses comes in, God through Moses comes in and tells Pharaoh that the people are going to be taken out of the land, and they need to go worship God. And the 10 plagues happen, and the people are eventually set free, and they find themselves in the wilderness, and they are hungry. They are hungry, just like people were hungry in Genesis 47. When the people came to Joseph and said that they were hungry, Joseph took everything they had and enslaved them to give them food. When the people said to God in the wilderness that they were hungry, God provided them a gift, provided them manna. And there's one verse that kind of sums up what happened there. Um, those who gathered much had nothing over, and those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. This manna came fresh every morning, and um, and provided food freely. No enslavement necessary, no money necessary, and everybody had enough. Nobody had too much and nobody had too little. I mean, just imagine that as a description of a culture. Imagine if that was our culture. It's almost unimaginable that way. Um, this story of manna in the wilderness was another story of resistance for ancient Israel, because it recalled that Genesis story where abundance was a gift from God, not something that had to be worked for by slaves. And so it is a story of resistance against the slave food economy of ancient Egypt. That's what this story is. Now, as the people came to the land, the land that was promised them, and I'm glossing over all kinds of parts of the story here that some parts are problematic, and that would be a whole different talk. Um, when the people entered into the land, there were all kinds of laws about how they were to live faithfully, and it was clear that justice around food was central to how they were to live in the land. So there were laws about ensuring that people were paid properly. There were laws ensuring that food was left on the edges of the fields for those who were hungry so that they could come and glean. Every 7 years, the land had to be left completely fallow, a Sabbath year, so that the poor and animals could just come and eat to their heart's delight off the land. But even before that, you were to never harvest right to the edge of your fields. You were to never harvest all of your olives or all of your grapes. You were to always leave some for those who had nothing. Um, it was an attempt in ancient Israel to ensure that there would always be enough. And all of that came to a culmination in what was called the Jubilee legislation. And these were laws that said every 25 years, slaves were to be freed. And here's the thing, in ancient Israel, people most commonly became slaves if their crops failed, and they had borrowed seed to maybe plant next year's crops and were unable to pay that loan back. And so their land was taken and they became slaves. Slavery was the result of debt. The laws actually said that every 7 years, debts were forgiven and slaves were set free. But every 25 years, slaves were set free and the land was returned to those who had originally been given it when they came into the land. So the Jubilee legislation ensured a number of things, and I'll put these up on the screen as well. This was in Leviticus 25. So every 50 years, the land receives a year of rest. So the land was to rest. Slaves were to be set free. The land is to be returned to the original farmers, those who originally were caring for it. And the text stresses the land belongs to God. And the implications of this legislation, of this very interesting law, which kind of comes at the climax of all of the laws, are these. If they're selling the land, you're only selling the crops, because the land refers to the original farmer in the year of Jubilee. You never actually sell land, you only sell crops. And that's because the land belongs to God. It is a year of economic forgiveness. If you have fallen into debt, the text never actually asks why somebody might fall into debt. It never says only those who fell into debt because they happen to be sick, or only those who fell into debt because because they were working hard but they just didn't have the skills. It never asks a question about whether it was somebody's fault that they fell into debt. It's just, no, you are forgiven and the land is returned. This means that wealth is not generational. We talk about poverty in our context being generational, but in ancient Israel, wealth could not be generational. You could not keep amassing land and passing it on to your children and their children and their children. No, every generation you had to divest, give it back to people. So every generation, people started again with what they had, what their parents had had. Um, it means that large scale industrial agriculture, if you want to put it that way, is disrupted every 50 years. Those people who are adding, Isaiah 5 talks about those who added field unto field unto field. Well, you can't keep doing that. It's going to be disrupted, and it's going to go back to the small subsistence family farm every 50 years. And it also means that the slave economy is disrupted every 50 years, because those people who are adding farm unto farm unto farm are doing so because they're also enslaving the former owners of those farms, right? And those slaves provide the labor that enable in the ancient world somebody to farm that much land. Well, the slave economy is disrupted. The slaves are set free. Um, this is pretty this is pretty radical stuff in the ancient world. Every other ancient culture was built upon a system that assumed slaves would provide for the elite, and those slaves were necessary to have an elite class. And ancient Israel was saying, we're not going to have that kind of an elite class that is served by a slave class. That is going to be disrupted every 50 years. Now, there's no evidence this was ever practiced in ancient Israel, but I don't think that matters, actually. This was God's vision for what it would look like if the people lived justly. We've never managed to live up to many of God's visions as we find them in the biblical text, and that's okay. That doesn't mean we stop trying. That's why forgiveness is a big part of the story. But the question still remains, what might this have looked like? What might this have looked like on the ground? And it's when we get to the story of Jesus that we start to get an inkling of what this might have looked like. Jesus in Luke chapter 12, first of all, tells the story of a man who discovered he had enormous amounts of crops at the end of the year. And he decided to build bigger and bigger barns. And he said to himself, or to his soul, it actually says, to his life, uh, you know, you've got enough stuff. You can eat, drink, and be merry now because you've amassed all of this wealth, right? He's the man who, in building those bigger barns, is building his own little miniature ziggurat in the village that he's in, right? That big storehouse for everything that he has. And Jesus ends the story by saying, that night his very life was demanded of him. It doesn't actually say he died. It's saying it was demanded of him, everything that was important in his life. And Marnie points out that this reminds her of the book Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, and how mortgages for some people today, where interest cannot be charged. Yes, that's a Jubilee principle, right? Not charging interest for some mortgages. In contrast to that story of the bigger and bigger barns, Jesus repeatedly in Luke tells people to give away what they have, give it to the poor. Often we just read in Luke, when we read the story of the rich young ruler, and Jesus says to him, he says, what must I do to gain eternal life? And Jesus says, well, what have you done? And he talks about, obeying the laws. And Jesus says, one thing's left, sell all that you have and give to the poor. And he went away sorrowful. That's actually the third time that Jesus says that in Luke. 3 times he says, sell all that you have and give it to the poor. In the story, after this story of the man who built the bigger barns, Jesus talks about trusting that God will provide. He actually says, look to the birds of the air, look to the lilies of the field. Solomon was not dressed as well as they were. Solomon was the epitome of empire in the biblical story. Even the empires don't have as much as the lilies do. He's telling us not to have the kind of anxiety that makes it necessary for us to hoard food and money and land. Which is why when Jesus arrives in the village of Jericho and finds a man named Zacchaeus up in a tree, and calls Zacchaeus as the chief tax collector. He's very wealthy because not only when tax collectors collected taxes, they were collecting taxes for, the man above them who was sending it all to Rome. And of course, everybody was skimming some off at every level. So Zacchaeus needed to take as much as he could from those under him. Zacchaeus comes out of that tree and Jesus says, I'm coming to your house today, Zacchaeus. And interestingly enough, the first thing Zacchaeus says, Jesus hasn't said a thing to him about money. Zacchaeus says, I'm going to give away half of what I have. And if I've defrauded anybody, I'm going to give them 4 times as much back. Now, what made him say that? Why did he think that meeting Jesus and having Jesus visit meant divesting himself of possessions? Probably because Jesus he'd wanted to see Jesus because he heard what Jesus was teaching. And what Jesus was teaching was sell what you have and give it to the poor, give the money to the poor, right? That's what he kept hearing. A certain kind of generous abundance. He had heard that Jesus had fed people that he had met, that he had fed 5,000 people with a few loaves and fishes, and later 4,000 people, that Jesus welcomed all kinds of people to the table. There was this incredible generous abundance that surrounded Jesus. And Zacchaeus wanted to be part of that. Now, here's the thing. When we think of that story of Zacchaeus, we often think of that story in terms of money, Zacchaeus giving money away. But I want to show you a couple pictures that might shift that. These are pictures from a project in Africa, and it's called the Mafa Gospel. And what these African Christians have done is actually they've staged recreations of the stories of Jesus and then taken pictures of them, and then somebody paints them. So they created this picture. And it's really interesting. This is the story of the man with the bigger and bigger barns. So he's the guy in the nice white tunic in the middle, and it's spotless, right? He can afford to have his clothes washed beautifully. Notice behind him the line of women with baskets carrying food, and the women in front of him with baskets of food, and all the baskets that are on the ground in front of him. And some of these, the ones on the left there, those are bundles of wool. So people have sheared their sheep for him. And you see sheaves of wheat on the ground. There is rice, baskets of rice. And then there's the grain baskets that are going into his bigger and bigger barns. You see men putting things in the windows of storehouses because they're so full inside. That's the only way to add things. And that big pile of straw and hay in the background. Does this picture of the women with the baskets on their head all lined up remind you of anything? When I first saw it, it reminded me of that picture on that Babylonian vase of the men carrying up the baskets, right? So there's this incredible wealth that the man with the barns is storing up there. Now, this is their story of Zacchaeus. A similar village. There's Zacchaeus in the sycamore tree. Jesus in these Matthew gospel images always is wearing red. So he's the man in the middle with red, with his hand up in the air, telling Zacchaeus to come down. And you'll notice that the people looking up at Zacchaeus are kind of looking up out of the corner of their eyes. You know, that toddler there is looking up out of the corner of his eyes, the kid in blue, the guy sitting right under the tree. They don't trust him, right? And I think if we think of what then happened next with Zacchaeus, in light of this previous picture, imagine that what's happening in this picture is that this farmer is actually giving all those baskets with grain away, giving the wool away, giving the rice away. That's what the Zacchaeus picture would have looked like. It would have looked like the reverse of this. So Zacchaeus, when he pledged to give all of this back, a lot of it would have been food and grain, because that is how people paid their debts. That is how people paid the tax collector in the ancient world, with bushels of grain, with olive oil, with barley, with grapes for wine. And so when Zacchaeus redistributed everything, it would have been like a little jubilee, and all this food would have gone out. And I also suspect that Zacchaeus would have been giving land back as well. So Luke 19 gives us a little picture of what Jubilee might have looked like in the first century. A man named Zacchaeus heard what Jesus was saying and enacted that Old Testament Jubilee in his own context. Oh, I see Steve's dog is joining us. That's he wants in on the redistribution of wealth too. I can see that, and food for that matter. So this is just that's just one way in which in the New Testament we saw that Jubilee being enacted. After Jesus' resurrection, the readings that we're actually doing right now in the lectionary in church are all from Acts. And the early Christians enacted that Jubilee in a similar way. Those who had land sold it and shared the money with the community, right? They kept food in common, and they met together to break bread and to pray. And when it turned out that some of the Greek widows weren't getting enough food, they got together and picked some people to ensure that they would get food, right? Ensuring that everybody had food and access to food was central to this community, because they knew that that was central in the message of Jesus. Jesus came to reaffirm the abundance of creation for everyone that God had first called into being at the beginning of the story. And the early church made that a central pillar of everything that they did. And that's why I think Jesus, in leaving, I mean, it's so interesting what Jesus does at the end of his life there. He gives us a command to only do, well, to love one another, but also, what's the one thing we're supposed to do together? Eat. We're left with a meal, and the meal is to take wine and bread and remember that Jesus sacrificed everything for us, that Jesus gave up his life for us. And it's in the context of calling us to service for one another. And I think the church has pared down that meal too much. It should be every week we are setting a banquet table that anybody who is hungry can come and eat at. That's what I think Jesus was asking us to do there. That's what food justice would look like. So, in our own context, what does all of this look like? First of all, our own context isn't that different than either the Babylonian or the Egyptian context, right? We live in a global food system that relies on slave labor. Our low food prices are because of slave labor. Even food that comes from Ontario, we need those migrant workers to work at below minimum wage for 12 hours a day and live in inadequate housing in order to have cheap food. Um, our food system is dependent on cash crops that deplete the lands of those who are vulnerable. Um, that's part of our food system too. And we are part of a food system where we don't eat locally, where we import a lot of the food that we eat. And that's partly why it can be so cheap. And so the environmental cost is huge. So how do we resist that kind of a system? The first thing, I took away my last piece of paper and I don't have enough to keep them standing up now here. Part of resistance is telling another story, right? Part of resistance, as we saw in Genesis 1, is having a different story about the earth, not the earth as commodity and something that can be bought and sold and something that can be used up. A story of gift. Not a story about where other creatures are things that have to be destroyed for our food. That's what our food system is dependent on, right? A lot of our crops are made possible because farmers are spraying pesticides that kill all the other animals all the other insects, birds that might damage those crops, right? We kill other things so that we can have food. So we're telling a different story where other creatures are part of our web of relations, right? That we are earth creatures from the earth, just like other creatures are. And we tell a different story about who people are, that some people are not expendable, that we, North Americans, do not deserve to eat while others go hungry because we have taken their land for our beef, for our soy. That other people shouldn't, we need to be telling the story where other people don't have to work back-breaking hours at low pay so that we can eat as much as we want because food is so cheap. We need to be telling a story where all people are in the image of God. Even telling that kind of story, if we took it seriously, if it captured our imaginations, would fundamentally change how we look at the food system. Part of the resistance is disruption. So there's telling a different story, as in Genesis and Exodus, and then there's disruption, as in Jubilee. Jubilee disrupted the slave economy. So what would it look like in our context to disrupt the slave economy, to practice economic resets, forgiveness and justice, to ensure that wealth is not generational, to disrupt industrial agriculture? What I'm going to say in a minute, what that looks like. Part of that disruption is also practicing abundant generosity, right? Not being part of a system that hoards food. So how is such disruption being done, you might ask? An Indigenous activist, Winona LaDuke, says that if you want to engage, she says that the antidote to globalization, the antidote to a globalized food economy is relocalization. Think about your own local context. She actually says, go down to the river and pray. Discover the needs of your watershed. Ask the river, what do you need? What does this place need? That's one place to start. Learn your watershed and discover what its needs are. Discover what grows in your watershed. What are the foods that are native to this place? Another way to practice a very local economy is to create a very local food system. The most local food system you can create is a window box in your window or on your balcony and grow a few things there. That's as local as it gets. Or in your backyard. But here's the thing. Remember that in Genesis 1, food was given not just for people, but for all creatures. So when you grow something in your backyard or in your window box, grow not just for people, but for insects, for birds, for other animals. Plant for pollinators. Because then you will be providing food for all living creatures. Or go wider, plant in your community, build a community garden. that feeds your neighborhood and meets the food needs of your neighborhood. Ask yourself, who is hungry in my community? And what can we do to ensure that those people are not hungry anymore? Um, and support local efforts at food justice. So find the places in your midst where the meek, the hungry, those who hunger and thirst for justice are working to create networks to share food with those who have no access to it. There are those networks in your neighborhood. I guarantee it, and you can find them. In Toronto, some of you might have heard of the Dismantling White Supremacy Food Box, which I think is a great name for a food box. And that's a community shared agriculture food box that you get every week. And the food in that food box comes from various farms that are run by Black, people of color, Indigenous peoples. So the Black Creek Community Farm, also in Toronto, or Healing Hands Farm, or the African Food Basket, or Zawadi Farm. All of these are in Toronto. And they are places working for justice, particularly for people in the Black and Indigenous people of color community. But there are also places. Sorry, I'm just stuck here turning a page. There are also organizations that reconnect Indigenous peoples to the land, like Ojibikan in the Toronto area. And actually, if you go to Toronto Urban Growers, they have, I'll put these things up in a sec. They have a web page that lists Indigenous gardening initiatives in Toronto. Now, here's the thing. The Indigenous gardening initiatives are to help Indigenous gardeners learn to garden, but they need funding. So if you can, donate to these places, right? Donate to make it possible for Indigenous peoples from the area to learn the skills that have been lost. That's one way to, in a very local way, bring food justice back to your area. Another thing you can do, there's the Good Food Box link that Steve had put in. Learn about regenerative farming and permaculture. Find out what farms are doing in your area. But at a most basic level, the most basic thing you can do, and the thing you have to do if anything is going to change, is to change how you eat. Ask yourself how you're connected to the industrial food system. Try to eat what is local and in season. Ask people what's local right now. I've been eating a lot of beets and carrots because they're still good in my basement. They've kept through the winter. And our onions too, actually, and our garlic. The potatoes are pretty much done now. But and it's going to be a tough few weeks before some other thing. The rhubarb, we'll be eating rhubarb soon, before we have other things in our garden. Kale has come back, so we can be eating kale now. But ask yourself, find out what's local in your system, and eat in season. Don't eat strawberries in January. They don't grow here then, right? So find out when things grow here. There is no way to serve the land or live lives of food justice without a personal commitment to change our involvement with the industrial food system. And so once we begin to tell different stories of who we are, once we begin to see the places where disruption and regeneration are happening, then this actually won't feel so much like a sacrifice, but more like a vision of this better world that we want to be drawn into, a story that we want to be drawn into. And once we have that kind of feeling, oh, I see somebody just put asparagus and rhubarb up. Yes, we've been eating asparagus. Once we have that kind of a feeling of this vision and the opportunity it provides, then it will be something that we lie in bed, not worrying about, but thinking about, this is how I want to jump into that vision tomorrow. These are the things that I want to do. So the biblical text, I think, gives us a vision that provides us with that kind of desire and hope. And I'll stop there, and also notice in the chat that radishes grown under the cold frame are also available right now. That's true, actually. I have some seed. I should put it in. Okay, that's all. Are there any questions? Linda says to grow zucchini to experience abundance. Yes. Zucchini is how you can lose your friends. You can show up and they just turn around and walk away. Please don't leave that here. Sorrel, and there's other perennial things that are up now. Quite frankly, if you live in an area where there's no pesticides, you could be eating your dandelion leaves right now. They make a fine salad. So are there any questions or comments or observations? The course that I teach that that Steve audited, that's a course at Trinity College called Creation in the Biblical Story. So it's a 12-week course that at land, food, and justice. So we look at a few of the passages we looked at today, but also explore the question of idolatry, what that looks like in relation to the land. We look at the texts that talk about the land mourning when people are disobedient. We look at economic questions. Sabbath and Jubilee are part of a biblical economics, and how we think of economics affects the land. So we spend some time talking about that in the course. We look at Indigenous justice as well, and in Indigenous worldview connecting with the biblical story and the land. So, and I live in a farm, so we tie in stuff from where I live on the farm. And we shared recipes. That's true. And I also had little videos because I had to teach it online this year. I had little videos of some of our farm animals as well, which I'll be doing some more videos soon. We just had kittens born a couple days ago, and in about 17 days we'll have chicks, and we're getting some pigs later this week. So it's going to be a a lot of things to do videos of. But I also teach. I'm increasingly doing some courses over Zoom, and we'll probably be doing a course like a 6-week course on some of these topics over Zoom at some point under Bible Remixed, which is my kind of teaching from home for lay people brand. So if people are interested, I can let you know what courses are coming up there too. So the course that Steve took, I would not be teaching at Trinity again for till 2022. So it's not coming up again in the fall, but I'll probably do something online from home that's not a Trinity course on that topic before that. Any other comments or questions? People could also, if people wanted to, if you can't type something in, you can also feel free to unmute and ask something as well. Okay, what I'll do, Marnie, is are you connected to Steve? Because then I can send, I can have him, when I am going to be teaching on Zoom, I could send information to him and he could let the community know. Okay, somebody has, first of all, Ed, thank you. I'm glad you appreciated it. Somebody's asked from Facebook about hierarchy, but there's hierarchy in the Bible too with many kings. It's actually really interesting what happens in the biblical story with the kings in the text, because in 1 Samuel 8, the people of Israel at that point just have Samuel, a prophet who is judging, acting as a judge over them. And they say to Samuel, we want a king like the other nations. And Samuel is cut to the quick because, of course, these people weren't supposed to be like the other nations. They were supposed to be different. And they were supposed to be, the people of Israel were supposed to be the people who showed the rest of the world what it looked like when uh, a, a community lived in faithfulness to God and lived with justice and care for the most vulnerable. That's what they were supposed to be imaging to the other nations. So when they said, we want a king like the other nations, Samuel went to God and said to God, what should I do? And God said, well, first of all, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me as king. And you should tell them that if they get a king, their king is going to take their daughters to be cleaners and to be bakers. He is going to take their sons to fight his battles and to work in his vineyards and in his fields. A king is going to take a portion of your livestock and of your cattle. Basically, God says, you don't want a king, you're going to become slaves. And so Samuel goes and tells the people this, and they say, no, we want a king. We want a king. And God basically says, well, okay, let them have a king then. The kings in the biblical story are deeply ambiguous. And just the fact that the kings exist. And we see in the story that the kings do indeed, by the time you get to Solomon, and that was a whole other passage I could have included, but didn't have time. A passage like 1 Kings 24 talks about how Solomon had 12 officials that went to every single corner of Israel and gathered tribute and gathered wheat and barley and sheep and cows and horses and just every day in order to feed the king's table, the elites that were at the king's table. And there is this implicit judgment in the text of Solomon and what he has done. He also enslaves the people. So yes, that hierarchy does exist, but within the narrative, it is deeply, deeply problematized. In the story, this wasn't the vision that God had, and that's why the prophets, Isaiah 65 talks about this vision of the renewal of Jerusalem, and it says there, this is somewhere after verse 17 in Isaiah 65, it will not be the case that one person builds and another person lives there, or that one person plants and another person eats. If you build a place, you will live in it. If you plant, you will eat. That's the vision that God has, not where there's people doing these things, slaves doing these for the elites. Wow, I just realized how big my hands look when I put them towards the screen. Keep them back here. Okay. So I've Marnie, I'm gonna actually just put my email address in the chat right now. So please write it down, and if you want to know about courses that I'm going to be teaching, send me an email and I'll add you to the list of people that I send stuff out to. So when you do my email address, s.keesmaat@utoronto.ca, make sure you double the vowel, both sets of vowels in Keesmaat. It's hyper Dutch, but that's the most common mistake people make if it doesn't arrive. Okay, you're welcome, Jen. Any other comments or questions?
I have a question, I guess. So as part of this series that we're doing, one of the things that we are hoping to do is maybe do a couple of cooking demonstrations, encouraging people, of course, to eat more organic vegetables, which of course is better for the climate and doesn't rely on industrial farming. But we're also wanting this to be affordable for people of lesser means as well. And of course, our whole food system is designed that the junk food is cheap and the good food is expensive. So do you have any suggestions for how we might help people to eat healthier that maybe have lesser means?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Steve, because it kind of points up how the problems in the system are so intertwined. For instance, so a short answer is community gardens are one of the ways that creates possibilities for people to grow their own foods, especially if access is given to people to land that don't normally have access to land for growing. But there's kind of there's kind of a three-pronged approach that's needed around these issues. There's, on the one level, organic food is better. I mean, there is industrial organic agriculture too. So organic food is like the first small step to eating better, because you can be eating organic from California, right? You can be eating organic from BC. But if you're going to be eating from California or BC anyway, then organic is a bit better. It's always better to be eating local food. Local food that if it's local and organic, great. And if you're eating local food, you're more likely to be able to have some sense of how it has been grown or produced. And often local food is more ecologically produced. So that's kind of step number two. That's the slightly higher bar. But the third is creating systems where food sovereignty, of food justice and food sovereignty for people, so that people have access to the ability to grow their own food. And there are places in the city that are providing that. Often they're community gardens in different places, and the city of Toronto provides grants for people who want to put in community gardens now, and pollinator gardens. So there's a lot of support for this kind of thing right now. And that's where the most work is happening around kind of food justice and food access, I think. One way, I mean, there are also farmers who will partner with programs like what you're doing in terms of cooking food too. So some of the farms I listed, I'll put, I actually have a slide that has some of those farms on there, but it might be worth just connecting with, Black Creek Community Farm or Zawadi Farm, and seeing about a donation, asking them about how they're making food more accessible within the city. They're doing that particularly, Steve, in the class. I don't know if you saw the video of the guy from Zawadi Farm. He's farming in people's backyards all over the place, and he's the guy who sort of said, I don't. I'd never want to kill a rabbit. I mean, there's a rabbit that keeps eating my lettuce, but he's hungry too. So I'm just going to let him eat the lettuce. It's just, and this is a guy who's selling food for money. They have ideas about accessibility as well. Some of these initiatives. This is Ojibikan is the Indigenous Gardening Initiative in Toronto, and then the Toronto Urban Growers with the webpage. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer to that question, because price is a problem. It really is a problem for good food. Other comments or questions? I just put my glass of water down on a fly, first fly of the season. He was groggy, so he's a little dead. So when I went to drink out of it, there's this fly stuck on it. I'm sure that was a detail you all wanted to know, but anyway, it's just grossing me out. So after this talk about caring for other creatures, I have just killed something. There it is. Judith put a comment in about food boxes for low income homes, and Christine posted about food share. And yeah, that there is the Good Food Box that's also often available in Toronto. I think it's called the Good Food Box in Toronto as well. I know in Kawartha Lakes where I live, there are food boxes that are available that are subsidized, and I think Food Share does do some of those. Linda points out that insects are the best bet. For a long time, they've been saying that we're all going to be eating insects in the future, except we're experiencing a bit of an insect apocalypse right now. So I'm not sure that we're actually going to have enough insects for that going forward. Um, Lionel mentioned the need for a new narrative of resistance. I think this point about stories, the stories we tell, and needing new stories that shape the stories we tell really do shape how we think of the world, right? So if you grew up with classic fairy tales, where the beautiful princess marries the handsome prince, and then grew up watching television, which reinforces that story, and advertising, which tells you how to be beautiful so that you can meet the handsome prince or beautiful princess, um, that's a pretty dominant narrative in our culture, and has been largely destructive, I think, for the self-esteem of young people, for the ability of marriages to work. It's the same kind of thing with the narrative around land and food that is dominant in our culture. And so I think we need to um, we do need to be thinking about that different narrative. And quite frankly, uh, the indigenous peoples in our areas have a narrative that is more congruent with the biblical story than the narrative we generally tell in our culture. And so learning the narratives of indigenous peoples about our places, I think we will find that those narratives end up being life-giving in ways that fit in with the biblical stories narratives very well. And so that's another way that we can engage in that resistance. So Marnie tried cricket flour out of curiosity. I'm kind of wondering, Marnie, you didn't say how it was. You just said goodness me. and and about fairy tales. You could also, Marnie, just give us a thumbs up if the cricket flour was good or not. I would think crickets are gluten free, Steve. I think you're safe there. As are grasshoppers. Oh, I see. You bought it, Marnie, at goodness me. Um, it was terrible and dry, an acquired taste. So I imagine it would depend what you mix it up with. I mean, indigenous peoples made flour out of bulrushes and of course out of acorns, right? That was flour wasn't a huge part of their diet. Um, Jen says, like being aware of my own neighbors who are in need of a cooked meal or food trading or exchange of food for tasks. Well, and that's something that churches, churches have traditionally been very good at this, and I think have, in my senses, this has fallen off more. But traditionally, if people were ill or somebody had a baby or people were in need, food was prepared and delivered for people in church communities. And in fact, not even just in church communities, just in rural communities, that would happen as well. I live in a rural community. Um, but I don't think that happens so much anymore. What does happen in the community where I live, though, in the farming community, is the trading of food for tasks and the people who have abundance kind of phoning people up and saying, do you need any? I'm overrun with whatever it is. And by the way, I'm looking for this. And so a lot of bartering still happens in rural contexts, at least the rural context in which I live. So those of you who go to Redeemer, you need to know that cricket flour might be part of your communion bread. Is that what you're saying there, Steve? And Marnie's talking about Wellington Square United Church in Burlington has a huge meal program, and now with shutdown, meals are prepared and given as takeout. Actually, this is something that the church I'm affiliated with in Toronto, also a Church of the Redeemer, at the corner of Avenue Road and Bloor, just kitty corner from the ROM there. That church has a very large meal program. And what they did at the beginning of lockdown was they partnered with the local restaurants to buy meals, takeout meals from the local restaurants for the people on the street who are homeless, which meant that the restaurants continued to have an income as well. So it was something that made the local businesses benefited, the people on the streets benefited, and it actually has strengthened relationships between those businesses and homeless people on the streets. So there's a much bigger sense of the church being part of a community, which has been this kind of unintended benefit of COVID. It used to be just the church doing its thing with help from the community, but now the whole community is involved with providing food for the homeless, coordinated by the church. And that's really quite lovely to have happen there. Steve still has some entrees from neighbors in the freezer from when his son was born. It's like bishops I know, Steve. We have a bishop friend who's always giving us jam because he keeps getting jam from people and he's got way too much. Oh, the other Redeemer on Bloor. That's right. That's right. I guess you're both on Bloor. Yes, I hadn't thought of that. Your church still has a slightly more rural feel to it. It has green grass around it that is now compost enriched. That's been part of this program, right? That the compost week last week, right? You're welcome.
Yes. So on behalf of Redeemer, thank you so much. This was, I mean, I took the entire course, but I still learned things tonight. So I'm very grateful. This was a really informative, a great kickoff event to our series, because it kind of says why we as a faith group are interested in, caring for creation and social justice issues. And so you've kind of nailed that down for us as to why we as a church would be even interested in these things, and allowed us to share that with the community around us. So thank you so much. And I don't see any more comments. So we are only 2 minutes over. So timing wise, it worked out perfectly as well. Just so everybody knows, I did record this session, and I will put up an edited version of it on our YouTube page with a link to Facebook as well. And a reminder again, our next event is June 21st with an Indigenous elder who will share some of the things that we can do together for environmental justice. So we're looking forward to that as well. And again, if you would like to donate to Redeemer and so that we continue to do programming like this, just go to our website and click on Donate Now. Thank you everyone for coming, and have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.